Canada paid $4.6 billion for a bridge. Michigan owns half. And Trump threatened to block it anyway. That is not a meme. That is not just politics. That is a stress test of how North America actually functions when a leader tries to weaponize shared infrastructure. And it exposes something Washington doesn't want to admit. Power isn't only about being bigger. Power is about having options when pressure comes. February 11th, 2026. The Gordie Howe International Bridge is sitting there, essentially complete, spanning Detroit to Windsor. Roughly 15,000 workers on both sides of the border helped build it. Businesses are positioned for shorter routes, fewer bottlenecks, and lower logistics costs. And then the White House signals that opening this bridge can be treated like a bargaining chip, framed as Canada, treating the United States unfairly. If you're watching this and thinking, how does that even make sense? Good. Because the story only makes sense when you stop looking at the bridge as a bridge and start looking at it as a pressure point in a larger leverage campaign tied to tariffs, the USMCA review, and a Canadian Prime Minister who is quietly trying to remove the United States' ability to threaten Canada's economy on demand. Stay with me, because the reveal later is uncomfortable. There is a private economic incentive that benefits when this new public bridge is delayed. I'm going to explain that incentive structure carefully, without conspiracy theatrics. And then I'm going to show you why Mark Carney's response landed so hard in Washington. He didn't counter-threaten. He didn't posture. He used 4 facts that made the entire hostage narrative collapse on contact. Welcome back to the Dollar Watch. We break down the hidden economy, the contracts, the supply chain physics, the political incentives, and the strategic consequences that cable news can't explain in 2 minutes. Subscribe if you want the next briefings heading into the USMCA review window, because the bridge episode is not isolated, it's a preview. Let's start with the official posture from Washington, because you need to understand the frame being sold to the public. The White House position since early 2025 has been fair trade plus national security. A national emergency was declared in February 2025, and broad tariffs were imposed on Canadian goods. In August, the administration escalated those tariffs again. The headline numbers in the public discussion have been severe, 25% and then higher. Canadian energy was reportedly given a lower rate, which is the quiet admission that some dependencies are too dangerous to shock without blowback. The legal vehicle often cited for this type of move has been Emergency Authority, IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. That detail is not legal trivia. It's the core of the intimidation strategy. Because if you can declare emergency, you can bypass normal legislative friction and move fast. You can create uncertainty faster than your opponent can respond. In trade wars, speed is power, but the justification matters, and it's here that the narrative starts to wobble. The emergency framing leaned heavily on border and narcotics arguments. Yet publicly available data from U.S. Customs and Border Protection has consistently shown that the overwhelming share of fentanyl seizures are associated with the southern border, not the northern border. That doesn't mean cross-border crime with Canada is non-existent. It means the scale is not what the rhetoric implies. So if this isn't primarily about fentanyl at the northern border, what is it? Leverage. Tariffs are leverage tools. They're not moral judgments. They are economic weapons designed to force negotiation by injecting pain and uncertainty into another country's cash flow. And in 2025, the administration's strategic assumption was simple. Canada and Mexico depend on American market access more than America depends on them. Therefore, the United States can squeeze, and the other side will bend. That's the theory of power as size. Now enter Mark Carney. Carney becomes Canada's Prime Minister in March 2025 after an unexpected political turnaround. And whether you like him or hate him, the relevant fact is his background. He is not a retail politician. He is a technocrat with crisis credentials, former governor of the Bank of Canada, former governor of the Bank of England, and one of the few people alive who has run 2 G7 central banks. That matters because central bankers don't think in slogans. They think in liquidity, counterparty risk, and optionality. They think in systemic terms. What happens if this pipeline stops? What happens if that credit line is pulled? What happens if this dependency becomes a weapon? They build redundancy. They build buffers. So while Washington was escalating tariffs and threats, Carney began doing the one thing that makes coercion harder over time. He started building alternatives. This is where the timeline matters. On January 16, 2026, with tensions already elevated, Carney traveled to Beijing. The agreement announced was not framed as a sweeping free trade deal. It was framed as a limited arrangement, reduce specific tariff disputes, expand market access for Canadian agricultural exports, and do so while remaining consistent, at least in Canada's telling, with Canada's existing trade commitments. The deal structure reported publicly was politically explosive. Canada agreed to allow a capped number of Chinese electric vehicles into its market annually at a reduced tariff rate, something like 6.1%, for up to roughly 49,000 vehicles per year, with the cap potentially rising over time. In return, China significantly reduced tariffs on Canadian canola and reopened access for other exports. On paper, that looks like typical trade horse trading, but the timing is the signal. Carney did this while Washington was trying to squeeze Canada with tariff pressure. He did it while the U.S. was attempting to treat Canada like a subordinate market, and he did it with full awareness that Washington would interpret it as a provocation. Then, 4 days later at Davos, Carney gave a speech that wasn't about agriculture or EVs. It was about the world order. He described a rupture in what people call the rules-based international system. He argued, without naming Trump directly, that middle powers face a choice: compete for favor inside a superpower-dominated system or combine to create a third path. And he delivered the line that should have kept American strategists awake: if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. That's not a throwaway quote. That's doctrine. It says Canada is no longer betting its future on automatic alignment. It says Canada is building strategic redundancy. It says Canada has concluded that American market access is no longer a stable assumption. It's a variable that can be weaponized. Washington's public response was sharp. The president reiterated that Canada benefits from the relationship with the U.S. and suggested alignment isn't optional. Carney's response was equally clear. Canada's prosperity is rooted in its own sovereignty and institutions, and Canada will not wait for permission to build its economic future. Now, you might be thinking, this is just posturing. It's not. Carney moved from words to domestic industrial policy. On February 5, 2026, Carney announced a multi-billion-dollar EV affordability program aimed at accelerating adoption and production. Again, forget the marketing language. Focus on the strategic intent. Reduce vulnerability to external shocks by deepening domestic capacity in an industry that will define the next decade. Build internal demand. Pull investment into Canadian supply chains. Make Canada less dependent on any single external buyer or rule set. Washington responded with warnings about potential tariffs if Canada becomes an indirect entry route for Chinese components. Carney publicly emphasized compliance with existing agreements. But here's the reality. Once Canada demonstrates it is willing to diversify despite American pressure, the leverage model changes. Not overnight, but structurally. And this is where the Gordie Howe Bridge episode becomes more than a bridge story, because the bridge is a physical symbol of North American integration. It sits on the most important trade corridor on the continent. It is exactly the kind of choke point an administration looking for leverage would try to squeeze. And Trump did squeeze it, at least rhetorically. But the moment he did, he ran into a problem that is lethal to coercion campaigns. The contract was written down, and it included America. The Gordie Howe International Bridge wasn't conjured in secret. It was agreed in 2012 under a formal Canada-Michigan crossing agreement. The key terms are straightforward and publicly documented. Canada finances the construction. Ownership is shared with the state of Michigan. American labor, and American materials were part of the build, and the agreement includes a structure where, after costs are recovered through tolling, Michigan becomes eligible for a share of net revenues. This is why Carney's response was so effective, because it didn't require persuasion, it required recitation. Canada paid, Michigan owns half. Americans built it with us. It opens because both economies benefit. It's hard to run a hostage narrative when the hostage is co-owned by your own state. And here is where U.S. domestic politics suddenly mattered more than U.S. foreign policy. Michigan officials, including Republican voices, began reaffirming the basic deal terms. They didn't do it to protect Canada, they did it to protect Michigan. Because for Michigan, the bridge isn't a diplomatic trophy, it's an economic necessity. It is redundancy for the manufacturing artery that keeps plants running. It is a risk reduction asset for logistics. It is a throughput upgrade. Blocking or delaying it doesn't punish Canada cleanly. It punishes Michigan's own workers and businesses first. This is the part many viewers miss. In integrated systems, coercion boomerangs. If you weaponize a shared artery, you bleed too. Now let's get to the reveal I promised earlier. The private incentive problem. For decades, the dominant commercial crossing between Detroit and Windsor has been the Ambassador Bridge, a privately controlled asset that historically handled a massive share of truck traffic. The nearby tunnel has commercial limitations, so for heavy freight, the Ambassador Bridge functioned as a kind of toll gate on one of North America's most valuable trade routes. That toll gate generates revenue every day, and in economics, persistent revenue streams create political gravity. They attract lobbying, they attract legal maneuvering, they attract narrative campaigns about unnecessary competition or cost or control. So when a new publicly supported bridge is built, one designed for highway-to-highway connectivity, modern inspection capacity, and redundancy, the incumbent gate loses some advantage. Competition lowers toll power. Redundancy reduces bottleneck pricing, and it reduces the economic leverage of a private crossing on the corridor. Now, I'm not alleging a direct quid pro quo between Trump and any private actor. That's not what we can prove from public information. And as the Dollar Watch, we don't do storytelling without evidence. But we can say this with absolute confidence. There is a structural private incentive that benefits when the new bridge is delayed. And that incentive has existed long before this administration. That's why the Gordie Howe project has been controversial for years. It's why it attracted legal fights and political contention. Not because bridges are inherently controversial, but because monopoly-like positions don't surrender quietly. Now, connect that to Trump's threat. When Trump tried to turn the bridge into a hostage, it didn't just look like pressure on Canada. It looked like Washington injecting risk into Michigan's supply chain resilience. It looked like political theater overriding engineering logic. It looked like the only person in the room who hadn't read the contract trying to renegotiate the terms after the concrete was poured. And that's why Carney's response landed like a slap made of paperwork. It's difficult to bully someone when the bullying relies on pretending the agreement doesn't exist. Carney's call wasn't about winning a news cycle. It was about dragging the conversation away from Truth Social and back into administrative reality, where the project's governance, permits, and ownership are documented. And once the conversation returns to reality, Trump's framing collapses because reality includes Michigan. Now, this is the moment where you should stop seeing Carney as just a Canadian leader and start seeing the strategy. Carney is attempting to change Canada's power position by changing Canada's optionality. Most countries try to increase power by increasing size. More GDP, more military, more population. Canada can't do that quickly. It's a middle power. Middle powers increase power by increasing options, more export routes, more trade partners, more settlement flexibility, more industrial capacity in strategic sectors, more redundancy in critical supply chains, more credibility with multiple blocks. That's what Carney's Beijing trip was about, not choosing China. Choosing optionality. That's what Davos was about, not anti-Americanism. signaling that Canada will not be structurally trapped by American unpredictability. That's what domestic EV policy was about, not ideology, industrial resilience. And that is what unsettles Washington, not canola tariffs, not EV quotas, not speeches, the demonstration effect. If Canada proves that a middle power can maintain sovereignty, remain formally compliant with agreements, and still expand partnerships beyond American alignment, other allies will watch closely. South Korea, Australia, European mid-powers, any country whose security or trade architecture assumed stable American leadership. Because the moment allies begin treating American alignment as optional rather than automatic, American leverage declines. This is why the bridge episode matters. Because it shows that Washington's leverage tactics can collide with domestic stakeholders and written contracts, and that Canada can respond without escalation by refusing the emotional frame and continuing the diversification strategy. Now let's talk about the US side, because this is where the public often gets deceived. Tariffs are described as punishing foreigners. In practice, tariffs are paid by importers and transmitted into domestic prices. They function as a consumption tax. They raise input costs for businesses and, in many cases, raise prices for consumers. Business groups in border states understand this because they feel it in their balance sheets, not in their ideology. And that's why pressure is rising inside the US system too. Because prolonged tariffs and threats don't just hurt Canada and Mexico. They disrupt American producers who rely on Canadian and Mexican inputs. They hit energy interdependence. They hit autos. They hit agricultural supply chains. In other words, Washington can threaten, but it cannot threaten without cost. Which brings us to the most important calendar event in this entire story, the USMCA review in 2026. USMCA has a built-in review mechanism. That review is a leverage window. It is a deadline around which pressure campaigns are built. The administration's strategy appears to be create maximum leverage before the review and then negotiate from strength. That's classic bargaining. It's also dangerous because it incentivizes the other parties to prepare for permanent volatility rather than temporary conflict. Carney's strategy appears to be preparing for exactly that uncertainty. Not by abandoning the U.S. relationship, that's not possible in the short term, but by building enough alternatives that no single bilateral dispute becomes existential. That's what optionality looks like in statecraft. Now, here's the hard reality I want you to take away, because it's the core lesson. Trump's model of power is scale, bigger economy, bigger market, therefore guaranteed leverage. Carney's model of power is options. Diversify relationships, reduce dependency, build redundancy, therefore increase leverage. These are two different theories of power, and the world is watching which one performs better under stress. The bridge between Windsor and Detroit will almost certainly open because the incentives for opening it are structural. The contracts are established. The infrastructure is complete. Regional stakeholders on both sides need it operational. It's not just a photo op. It's a throughput upgrade. But the bridge is symbolic now. It represents a moment where a smaller country refused to escalate and refused to submit. It chose a third path, diversify. It represents a case study in how middle powers respond when alliances become unpredictable. And it hints at something larger, the slow drift toward a more multipolar economic order, driven not only by rivals like China and Russia, but by allies recalibrating their assumptions about American reliability. This isn't just about tariffs or EVs or canola. It's about sovereignty in 2026. Does sovereignty mean waiting for permission, or does sovereignty mean building alternatives? Carney made his move. Washington is still deciding how to respond. And if you're paying attention, you can see the real battle line now. It's not the border, it's optionality. Because when a country has options, threats become noise. And when a country has no options, threats become policy. That's why the Gordie Howe episode matters. It shows you who is building options and who is trying to substitute threats for strategy. If you want the next briefing, subscribe, because the next phase is approaching fast: the USMCA review window, the continuation of tariff pressure, and Canada's accelerating diversification deals. The bridge was just the moment the paperwork went public. The real transformation is happening quietly in contracts, logistics corridors, and alliances. And those are the things that decide who actually has power when pressure comes.